えやつだ。それが全力か。
Oh no!
Dead. D-E-D. Dead.
The Kenpachi. It is a title reserved only for the strongest Shinigami of a generation, and attainable primarily through killing the previous title holder in single combat. An unparalleled talent with the blade, seeking only the thrill that can be found in the heat of battle. Or at least that's how it was supposed to work. Throughout Soul Society's history, there has been a long and storied line of Kenpachis. However, I would argue that most, if not all of them, have never actually been the strongest Shinigami of a generation. Before I jump into the video, I feel as though I should preface something. I'll only be talking about the Kenpachis as they existed in the manga, so through the 1,000-Year Blood War. I'm aware of the existence of the novels and their canonicity, but I won't be taking them into consideration here. I haven't read them, and I honestly don't plan to. Don't get me wrong, they're probably good overall additions to the story in their own right, and they may even contain information that could have changed my stance on this video topic. But I didn't first get interested in Bleach by reading it as a wall of text, and I really don't see myself doing that now. If the novels ever get a manga or anime adaptations, then I'll talk about them, but only then will I talk about them. The first point to discuss is how Kubo likely meant to define a Shinigami in relation to the Kenpachi title. If a Shinigami has to be officially or directly affiliated with Soul Society, then Aizen, Ichigo, Urahara, and the Zero Division probably wouldn't qualify for consideration. Aizen betrayed and waged war against Soul Society, but then again he also fought for them in their time of need during the 1,000-Year Blood War, so I don't really know where that leaves him on the alignment scale. Like a frenemy, I guess? Ichigo is like an honorary part-time Shinigami for Soul Society, but he isn't actually part of Soul Society, and they have no directional power over him. Urahara supports Soul Society of his own volition, almost like a consultant or a contractor, but they don't have directional power over him either. And the Zero Division isn't technically affiliated with the lower realm of Soul Society, where all other Kenpachis have resided, so they probably wouldn't qualify for consideration either. If a Shinigami has to be strictly that in terms of their racial background, then Aizen and Ichigo probably wouldn't qualify for consideration. I don't know if Aizen is still considered purely a Shinigami after his fusion with the Hogyoku, and as a matter of fact, I don't even know if he's still fused with it. Ichigo was a composite being of all racial backgrounds at one point, but Yuha absorbed his Quincy and Hollow aspects, so I don't know if that makes him purely a Shinigami now, ignoring Ichigo's primarily human existence just for the sake of the argument. Presumably Ichigo didn't also lose his Fullbringer aspect, but that's unknown. So depending on which definition of Shinigami you subscribe to, or if you choose to apply both, several powerful contenders may be cleared off the board for the Kenpachis. The next point to discuss is how Kubo likely meant to define a generation in relation to the Kenpachi title. If a generation was based on the time of a Shinigami's birth, like generations are in our world, then the Kenpachis may indeed be legitimate. However, the problem with going off of a Shinigami's ages is that we don't even know how old most of them are, which prevents us from arranging them in generations like our world does. We also can't do a visual comparison of ages because someone like Unohana looked to be in the same age range as someone like Matsumoto, and she's easily a few hundred years older. If a generation was based on the Shinigami living at the time, then the Kenpachis are almost certainly fraudulent for the most part. From the first Kenpachi to the 11th Kenpachi, they would have all been compared against monstrous gatekeepers like Yamamoto, Aizen, Kyoraku, and Urahara. And if the Zero Division was also part of the consideration, then that adds 5 more contenders, with Ichibei being chief among them. The next point to discuss is whether any of the Kenpachis were actually the strongest Shinigami under the previously discussed parameters of what a Shinigami and generation are defined as, which would likely exclude Aizen, Ichigo, Urahara, and the Zero Division from consideration. Of the 11 Kenpachis that have spanned Soul Society's history, we're only aware of 3 of them. Although it'd probably be more accurate to say 2 because we really don't have any scaling for one of those 3. Unohana was the first Kenpachi, so we'll start with her. Unohana made some statements about her own strength, and before I jump into those statements, I just wanted it to be known that I'm going to be paraphrasing them just a little bit to properly frame their context. But Unohana said, "I am strong, stronger than anyone but Zaraki. And Zaraki was the only person in the world that could make me happy through battle." The first statement was made in the present tense, so we would have to exclude from consideration any powerful Shinigami that were dead at the time, like Yamamoto. And when compared to living Shinigami, like Kyoraku and Urahara, I think Unohana comes up a bit short on the eye test. Unohana Shikai summons a large manta ray-like creature that can heal others using its stomach acids, which isn't really a battle-centric ability. And given the rule that Shikai and Bankai abilities are inherently related in some way, I'm led to believe that Unohana's Bankai centers around acids, but of the destructive variety, which is in polar opposition to her Shikai, but still related. However, that's just my guess on what Unohana's Bankai does, because it's never actually been clarified, to my knowledge anyway. Unohana's Bankai may be powerful, but it's also a double-edged sword of an ability that endangers her as well. She has healing to offset the danger to herself, but the Bankai seems to have limited usability and versatility, seemingly only being able to operate at typical sword ranges. So it may be possible for a comparably powerful opponent to neutralize her from a distance, and she doesn't exactly scale extremely high in the verse, having been defeated in her Bankai state by an awakened, no eye patch, base Zanpakuto wielding Kenpachi Zaraki. Meanwhile, Kyoraku and Urahara contended well with amped up members of Yuha's Royal Guard who would clap that Kenpachi Zaraki. Kyoraku has shadow manipulation and minor reality warping. Urahara has minor reality warping, along with his Kido mastery and unmatched intelligence in the series. The second statement was made in the past tense, so the considerations would include Yamamoto this time, who I would argue destroys Unohana on the eye test. I probably don't need to mention any of this, but Yamamoto's Zanpakuto is stated to be among the most powerful in Soul Society's history. Yamamoto's Bankai clads him in an armor of the sun, his blade burns anything it touches out of existence, and he can raise from the dead everyone who's ever been killed by his flames. Meanwhile, Unohana is rocking acid. Now don't get me wrong, acid is a fine thing, but acid just doesn't burn quite like the sun does. So I don't think Unohana factually made the cut for the Kenpachi title. Kenpachi Kiganjo was the 10th Kenpachi, and we know next to nothing about him. The only thing we know about his strength is that he got one-shotted by a subconsciously suppressed, no eye patch, base Zanpakuto wielding Kenpachi Zaraki, who would have been fodder to Unohana at that time. He's honestly a footnote of a character in the series whose total existence is limited to 3 pages, so Kenpachi Kiganjo definitely didn't factually make the cut for the Kenpachi title. Kenpachi Zaraki was the 11th Kenpachi and reached the known peak of his power towards the end of the Thousand-Year Blood War, removing his self-imposed limiters and achieving both his Shikai and Bankai in the arc. Being that the Bankai is seemingly only usable in short bursts before the user's body gets mangled by its own power, and it potentially inhibits intelligent thought above base instinct, I would argue that Kyoraku and possibly Urahara are slightly more powerful overall. However, I don't think there's any question that Kenpachi Zaraki has the greatest raw power among them though. And I won't deny that there are several narrative implications that Kenpachi Zaraki was the strongest Shinigami, as defined above. Unohana claimed that he was the only person stronger than her, and enabled her to feel a thrill in battle. He proclaimed himself to be the strongest when fighting Grimmy. Both the Quincy and the Shinigami thought the defeat of him in a weakened state would effectively be the end of the war. He was on the special war potentials list, which Kyoraku, Unohana, and Yamamoto didn't even make. And he was manhandling arguably the strongest of Yuha's Royal Guard, effective immortality aside. So the only Kenpachi that I can say was arguably strong enough to factually make the cut for the Kenpachi title was Kenpachi Zaraki, and that happened in the very late stages of the overall narrative. The final point to discuss is the stipulation of the current Kenpachi needing to be killed in single combat for a new Kenpachi to be crowned. Because of this rule, the title has been getting transferred illegitimately since its inception. Unohana was the very first Kenpachi, and yet she was still alive into the tenure of the 11th Kenpachi. So that would mean that 9 of the historical Kenpachis weren't actually Kenpachis at all. And Kenpachi Zaraki was actually the second historical Kenpachi. And that's all assuming that Unohana was actually strong enough to be worthy of the Kenpachi title in the first place. So, convoluted to say the least. I get that Kubo's intent for the Kenpachi title was to establish hype for a specific subset of characters and to build out Soul Society's world by adding further lore to its history. However, when you really dive into the details of the series, it becomes plain to see that the effort ended up being more flash than substance, and the Kenpachis kind of just come across as a bunch of paper tigers. But that's all I've got for y'all today. Those are just my opinions and conclusions that I've reached based on evidence, logic, and reasonable interpretations and assumptions. They're not necessarily facts of the story, but be sure to like the video, but only if you did. Subscribe for more content like this. Comment down below to let me know your stance on the discussion. Feel free to disagree with me if you do, but please do it respectfully and give an explanation as to why, along with your evidence. Night Reigns, out.